Movies are hard to make as a rule of thumb, and even more so when you don't have the proper resources to make movies safely. And John Boorman, who directed Deliverance, said this, quote, "It's a tough world making movies. If you want to fight for your ideas and principles, it's tough," end quote. In this video, I want to take a look at some of the most difficult movie productions of all time. Some were well budgeted, others weren't. But they all share one thing in common: they were hell to make. Almost everyone made it through alive, but they weren't always sure that that would be the case. Since we started with the Boorman quote, it's fitting to start with the Boorman movie. 1972's Deliverance, directed by John Boorman, is thought to be one of the best films of 1972. It's a harrowing movie that was also harrowing to film. It's about four guys from Atlanta, Georgia that decide to take a trip in the Georgian wilderness that not all of them will come back from, and the ones that do are irrevocably changed. Warner Brothers, who produced the movie, was uneasy about doing so. In Boorman's words, the studio, quote, really didn't want to make the film in the end. They got cold feet about the rape in particular. Studios, when they don't want to make a film, reduce your budget hoping you'll go away, end quote. In the end, he had to settle for a $2 million budget. Boorman would end up in a fistfight with James Dickey, who wrote the novel that the movie is based on. Dickey took issue with changes that Boorman made to the film, something that always happens when adapting a novel, of course. The fact that he was an alcoholic did not make the situation any better. One day, he attacked Boorman. The director was 7 inches shorter than Dickey and suffered a broken nose and 4 missing teeth. Shockingly, this was not what caused Boorman to eject Dickey from the set. The bigger issue was that Dickey would show up drunk to set and annoy the other actors, which eventually led to his removal, though everyone would make up by the end of the movie. The four main actors, Jon Voight, Burt Reynolds, Ned Beatty, and Ronny Cox, didn't have it any easier either. Each of the four came close to death. A big part of the reason was that, going back to the beginning, the small budget. That means that they couldn't get stuntmen, so they had to do all the stunts by themselves. All of them had at least one harrowing encounter. Ronny Cox and Ned Beatty would both end up falling into the water during a rafting scene. Cox was about to go over a waterfall before he was saved, while Beatty sank to the bottom and said that his last thought was, quote, "I hope they find someone else to finish the scene," end quote. This might seem perfunctory, something you just say in an interview, but death was a real fear on the film. Boorman shot the movie sequentially, unlike most films, so that if one of the actors did die during filming, they wouldn't run into any continuity issues. A cold and macabre calculation to be sure, but the show must go on. Voight, meanwhile, had to film a rock climbing scene. In his words, quote, "I was about 10 feet up on the face, which was slippery and almost perpendicular," end quote. He started to fall off and had to call out to a couple of grips below to catch him. They did, but it could have been disastrous. According to Voight, quote, "There was a sharp rock inches from my head," end quote. Burt Reynolds probably had it the worst though. There's a scene where he needs to go down a waterfall. Down he went. Unfortunately, he smashed into a rock that cracked his tailbone and gave him a back injury that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Of the film, Reynolds would later say, quote, "It was crazy, absolutely crazy. But we did it, and I'm glad we did it. Would I do it again? Not for $3 million, end quote. Despite the risks, they delivered a bona fide classic. Kevin Reynolds had two wild productions in the mid-90s, 1994's Rapa Nui and 1995's Waterworld. The first was an abject failure at the box office, while the second was the most expensive movie ever made at the time, and both were difficult shoots. It's actually impressive that Reynolds managed to retain his sanity. Before talking about Waterworld though, I think it's worth giving an honorable mention to Rapa Nui. 1994's Rapa Nui was made on a budget of $20 million and grossed a paltry $305,000 at the box office. Not $305 million, $305,000. Lighting the money on fire actually would have been more useful, but I digress. The movie was about the history of Easter Island and, by Reynolds' admission, was the hardest film that he'd ever made. He said that, quote, "Because of the remoteness of the location and the circumstances we were shooting under, it was like a Werner Herzog picture," end quote. Reynolds, like Herzog, wanted to film on location, so they shot on remote Easter Island, where they had one flight a week to mainland Chile. That means that the logistics are what made the shoot difficult. There were even times when they ran out of food. While Reynolds considers Rapa Nui the hardest production, others would say that honor belongs to Waterworld. Basically Mad Max at sea, the movie blew past its original $100 million budget and landed somewhere around $175 million. It was filmed on the water, so Kevin Reynolds obviously studied Jaws production. One issue Jaws had was that boats would sail into the frame of the movie, so Spielberg had to reshoot a take. Hell, Spielberg himself warned Reynolds and star Kevin Costner to not do this movie. But Reynolds was determined to do the movie and to avoid this issue. He could do two things. 1. Digitally remove the boats, which was still expensive and imperfect at the time, or 2. Build an artificial atoll a mile off the coast of Hawaii, which they could turn to adjust the shot framing. Of course, he chose this much more reasonable option. Like with Rapa Nui, the logistics were terrible. In Reynolds' words, quote, "We had to transport those people from dry land out to the location, and so you're getting hundreds of people through wardrobe and everything, and you're putting them on boats, transporting them out to the atoll, and trying to get everybody in position to do a shot. And then when you break for lunch, you have to put everybody on boats and take them back to feed them," end quote. What was supposed to be a 96-day shoot became a 150-day shoot, similar to what happened with Jaws. People started calling the production Kevin's Gate in reference to Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate, and they weren't far off. Camera placement and lighting are two of the most important things when it comes to film. Both were uncontrollable during filming. Bad weather was a constant hindrance, and because Reynolds and the camera crew were on a separate boat, waves would sometimes carry them away from the scene they were filming, meaning they had to reset and start again. Sometimes the wind and water would also ruin the actor's hair or makeup or wardrobe, and so they had to wait for them to go through that process again as well. Even the simplest shots became a chore to get. It didn't help that Mother Nature also had it out for the film. One of the smaller sets they filmed on sank during a storm and had to be repaired, while the trimaran boats they used could prove taxing. Kevin Costner got caught in a storm while tied to the mast one time and nearly died. Other actors nearly drowned when their trimaran sank. The waters also had jellyfish, so some of the cast and crew also suffered stings. On top of all that, the production was a media circus. Similar to what James Cameron experienced on Titanic, it was as though the media wanted to see a giant production fail. Of the situation, Reynolds said, quote, "The press just suddenly decided it was more enjoyable to hate it than it was to like it. It was condemned before it was even finished," end quote. Kevin Reynolds would end up leaving Waterworld due to creative clashes with Kevin Costner, though one imagines that he might have been happy to get away from it all. Eventually, the two would reunite for the Hatfields and McCoys miniseries in 2012. Still, one needs to applaud the ambition required to make such a wild movie. This is what Francis Ford Coppola said about 1979's Apocalypse Now, quote, "We had access to too much money, and little by little we went insane," end quote. How insane? Keeping a loaded gun on hand to shoot himself with just in case insane. Francis Ford Coppola took inspiration from Werner Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God, with regards to filming on location for Apocalypse Now. Surely he must have known that Aguirre was a very painful shoot for everyone involved, so the fact that he did it should clue us in into how seriously he took his art. There are so many things that went wrong, I think it's best to run down a list of issues. 1. He couldn't get his choice of actors. Steve McQueen, Jack Nicholson, Al Pacino, Tommy Lee Jones, Robert Redford, and Clint Eastwood all turned down the movie because they didn't want to spend months in the Philippine jungle. 2. Harvey Keitel, who did say yes to playing Captain Willard, was dropped within a couple of weeks and replaced with Martin Sheen. 3. Martin Sheen had an actual heart attack and had to crawl a quarter of a mile to get some help. He survived, but Coppola would blame himself for the episode. 4. Everyone got dysentery. Some people even got hookworms. 5. 2 months into the planned 4-month shoot that would last over a year, Typhoon Olga destroyed many of their sets and shut down production. This incident put them over budget by millions and behind schedule by weeks. 6. Some locals ran off with their payroll, as in money literally got stolen. 7. A member of the construction crew died while building one of the sets. 8. There was an insurgency going on in the Philippines at the time, so the helicopters that they were using were sometimes unavailable because they were needed for actual combat. This sometimes meant that they needed to be repainted American and Filipino colors in the same day. 9. When Marlon Brando showed up, he was overweight and unprepared. He hadn't even bothered to learn his lines. Basically, he was there to collect his hefty paycheck. He only signed on for a month, would only work weekdays, and never passed 5:30. And for the first week, he just didn't film at all, preferring to talk to Coppola about his character. And 10. Coppola took out more than $10 million in loans, offered his house, winery, and profits from The Godfather as collateral, and promised to make $40 million in theaters, otherwise he would be personally responsible for the overruns. Basically, it's not difficult to see why Francis Ford Coppola's mental state slowly deteriorated over the 238 shooting days. On 3 occasions, Coppola threatened to shoot himself. This was, no doubt, partly influenced by the drugs and alcohol on set. But one day, the stress led to an epileptic seizure, and Coppola thought that this was it. According to Easy Riders Raging Bulls by Peter Biskin, Coppola was, quote, banging his head against the wall, thrashing about on the floor, foaming at the mouth, end quote. Coppola thought that he was going to die, and, quote, his last request was that Lucas finish the film, end quote, as in George Lucas. He ended up making it through, though perhaps that might have upset some people at United Artists. The company, which loaned him millions, had also taken a $15 million insurance policy on his life. Coppola once joked that he was worth more to them dead than alive. His wife, Eleanor Coppola, would later release a documentary, Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse, which detailed the travails of the production. The movie would turn out to be a success. All it cost was Coppola's sanity and nearly his life. Sam Raimi, who would go on to direct the Spider-Man trilogy and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, directed his first movie when he was just 18. That was 1977's It's Murder, but it was 1981's The Evil Dead, one of the iconic horror movies that put 22-year-old Raimi on the map as a director to watch. While its reputation has grown considerably in the decade since its release, it was a critical and commercial success back then as well. The production of the movie was brutal. Raimi was more than willing to inflict actual pain on his actors to get the desired performance. According to Raimi, quote, if everyone was in extreme pain and misery, that would translate into a horror, end quote. As it turned out, there would be plenty of pain and misery to go around on The Evil Dead. It all began with the location, a remote cabin near Moorestown, Tennessee in the latter part of 1979. The conditions were stark and cold, and all of the 13-strong crew had to squeeze in to make it work. The baseline was already uncomfortable, and it would get worse from there. For example, they got lost while filming the first day, and because of the remoteness, it took a long time to get any medical assistance when people inevitably got injured. Some of the issues were with the effects and prosthetics. The fake blood was made out of food dye and corn syrup, which could take hours to remove. This doesn't seem terrible until you take into account that this was in 15-degree weather and most of the actors did double duty as crew members as well. There was no heat or running water at the cabin either. According to actress Ellen Seinweiss, who also served as a camera operator, quote, the only thing we had was the coffee maker full of coffee, not water. So I had to pour hot coffee over my hands to get the blood off them and to warm them up enough to be able to load the 16mm cameras. It was a very hard, physically difficult experience, end quote. Another actress, Betsy Baker, tore off her eyelashes when removing a mask. Lead actor Bruce Campbell, when running down a hill, tripped and injured his leg. Most people would be asking how someone is and seeing if there was anything we could do. Not Raimi though. He preferred to stoke the pain and discomfort, poking it with a stick. Campbell and Raimi were friends since high school, though, so perhaps this might not be as bad. Still, Campbell once said that the movie was, quote, 12 weeks of mirthless exercise in agony, end quote. So, obviously, there were some issues. Still, he says that, overall, it was a fun experience. Fitzcarraldo, directed by Werner Herzog, is probably the movie most associated with difficult productions. It had a literal tribal warfare, the hauling of a 320-ton steamship, and Klaus Kinski, a natural disaster in human form. It was a deadly, dangerous shoot, one where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and where most of the issues were self-inflicted. People died or suffered lifelong injuries. Herzog was inspired by a single detail from the life of Carlos Fermin Fitzcarraldo Lopez, a Peruvian rubber baron. That was that he disassembled and reassembled a boat en route from one river system to another. Fitzcarraldo's steamship weighed just 30 tons though. Herzog wanted to up the ante. He wanted the extras to haul a 320-ton steamship over a hill. In his words, quote, this is a film that challenges the most basic laws of nature. Boats just are not meant to fly over mountains, end quote. That's true enough. While scale models were used for other scenes, such as when the boat is on the river rapids, no special effects and no scale model was used for the hauling scene. It was to be done by the Machaguenga, the local indigenous peoples, and by their own hands. They got help from a winching system and an unreliable bulldozer. Hundreds of extras pulled the ship up a hill, but they had to stop at the top. The water on the other side had receded, and they needed to wait for the rainy season to fill the river back up. Miraculously, no one died during this scene. Keyword being this scene. One big reason the film is considered so difficult and painful is because of the location. It was filmed in the jungle. Jungles are hot and humid, rife with disease, difficult to navigate, hard to get supplies in and out of, away from any amenities, and full of things that want to kill you. Nick Thorpe, writing for the Sunday Herald, wrote that one day, quote, a Peruvian logger bitten by a deadly snake made the dramatic decision to cut off his own foot with a chainsaw to prevent the spread of the venom, end quote. Someone else drowned while piloting a canoe, while nearly half a dozen people suffered critical injuries during 2 plane crashes. One of them ended up paralyzed. The wildest story is the intertribal warfare though. Nick Thorpe wrote, quote, "In one of the region's driest summers on record, scavenging Amawaka tribespeople launched a scavenging hit-and-run raid on the film camp. One man was lucky to survive an arrow through his throat, while his wife was hit in the stomach, necessitating 8 hours of emergency surgery on a kitchen table," end quote. Herzog helped out, saying, quote, "I assisted by illuminating her abdominal cavity with a torchlight and with my other hand sprayed with a repellent the clouds of mosquitoes that swarmed around the blood," end quote. Some of the extras, which consisted of the Machagwinga, considered launching a revenge raid, but Herzog supposedly convinced them otherwise. They used up all of their anesthesia thanks to this incident, so when cinematographer Thomas Malk split open his hand, he had to get 10 stitches without any painkiller. He called it, quote, "the worst pain I have ever experienced," end quote. At least medical treatment saved his life though. Part and parcel of the jungle is disease, and some of the extras would not make it. And then of course there was Klaus Kinski, a very violent actor. He and Herzog had a pyrrhic relationship. Of it, Herzog said, quote, "We had a great love, a great bond, but both of us planned to murder each other," end quote. Kinski would get into fights with everyone, and his erratic behavior terrified others, especially the Machagwinga. The chief of the tribe even offered to assassinate Kinski once, though Herzog said no. But Herzog probably regretted it because he did try to murder Kinski one night by setting his place on fire with Kinski still inside. Herzog got as far as lighting the fire before Kinski's dog attacked him. Herzog was clear-eyed about the making of the film, saying, quote, "I shouldn't make movies anymore. I should go to a lunatic asylum," end quote. The thing about James Cameron is that most of his productions have been difficult. He came down with a fever on Piranha 2, which was stolen from him. He was almost run over by the APC on Aliens, which was adapted from a plane tractor that weighed as much as 77 tons. He nearly drowned on The Abyss, and he risked his own life to research the Titanic. But I'm going to zero in on The Abyss, a particularly troubled production that was difficult even by Cameronian standards. In fact, this is what he said about it, quote, "I knew this was going to be a hard shoot, but even I had no idea just how hard. I don't ever want to go through this again," end quote. The Abyss was released exactly 3 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. It sees an oil platform crew and some Navy SEALs dive into the ocean to a downed submarine before the Russians can get it. There, they encounter NTIs, or non-terrestrial intelligence, aliens basically. The movie is also notable for the water tentacle scene, which was a landmark in CGI at the time. Now, this is a water movie. That should clue you into the fact that this was going to be a pain. That's compounded by the fact that it takes place in the water, not just on it. Filming in the ocean would have been impossible, so they used Cherokee Nuclear Power Plant in South Carolina, which had a partially built reactor. The reactor was modified to hold 7.5 million gallons of water, while a smaller turbine pit was filled with 2.5 million gallons. Filming was delayed immediately by a number of problems. A storm rolled in, water pipes burst, the cast and crew couldn't see in the murky water. This was compounded by how long they spent in the water. Shooting days could be 15 to 18 hours long, and the crew was often around 30 feet deep. Speaking of the water, they had trouble getting the chlorine levels right. Some people got burns, while other people had their hair either fall out or change colors. There were several harrowing incidents as well. One was when James Cameron nearly drowned. The cast and crew, except Cameron, had safety divers. Cameron also wore ankle weights to help him walk along the bottom and had his assistant director keep watch on his oxygen levels. He was to be notified when he only had 15 minutes left. One day, the AD dropped the ball. Cameron took a breath from his regulator and got no air. He looked around, but it was too dark, so no one could help him either. He popped off his helmet and buoyancy vest and started a free ascent. He got a part of the way there when a safety diver noticed and raced over to help. Unfortunately, when the safety diver gave Cameron his backup regulator, Cameron found that it was broken. Instead of giving him air, it gave him water. Cameron was choking and tried to get away, but the safety diver, thinking he was panicking, held him in the water. Cameron punched the safety diver and made it to the top, where he fired both the AD and the safety diver. Cameron survived, probably to the chagrin of his cast and crew. After all, this was the movie where Cameron earned his reputation for running a brutal set. Actors Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio and Ed Harris did not get off any easier. There's a scene towards the end where Mastrantonio is laying on the cold, hard floor, soaking wet, her eyes open and unblinking, achieved by using eye drops that made it hard to see. Ed Harris is repeatedly slapping her, and just when they thought that they had a good take, they found the shot wasn't well positioned. Okay, change it up. The second take was also good when they realized that the camera was out of film. Mastrantonio was furious. She screamed, quote, "We're not animals here," end quote, at Cameron and stormed off the set, refusing to do another take. Harris finished it on his own. To his credit, Cameron understood that he was the one at fault here, specifically saying, quote, "It was our fault," end quote. Ed Harris, meanwhile, nearly drowned a couple of times. One was where he had to swim along the bottom without a suit, and a safety diver took their sweet time getting him a breathing regulator. The second time was the worst though. It's when Harris goes into the abyss. His helmet was filled with water as he went down. In Harris's words, quote, "The worst moments for me were being towed with fluid rushing up my nose and my eyes swelling up. Once, the regulator was put in upside down so that one half of what was going into my lungs was water. For a brief second, I thought, this is it, before Al swam over and put the regulator in right," end quote. Later that evening, Harris, understandably, broke down and cried. It's little wonder that the movie would be nicknamed The Abuse. There are so many movies that were wickedly difficult that it's impossible to cover them all in one video. Off the top of my head, I left off The Island of Dr. Moreau, Predator, Jaws, Star Wars, Sorcerer, Heaven's Gate, Roar, Monos, Mad Max Fury Road, Ishtar, The Revenant, Alien 3, and others. But I wanted to focus on movies that had a painful physical component to them, not just difficulty amongst cast members or issues with the studio. One thing to note is that while all of these movies were difficult to make, most of the cast and crew look back on them fondly or as formative experiences. That's not to say that they couldn't have been easier, but perhaps the difficulty is part of what made all of these such interesting movies.